right, welcome to Module 6. This module is going to be on tissues. So we're going to see the four general categories of tissues in this module. So here are your extensive learning objectives. As I said, we're going to start by looking at the primary tissue types. There's 4 main categories. Then we'll talk briefly about tissue membranes. So, the 4 primary types of tissue. First of all, let me remind you what is a tissue, right? A tissue is a group of similar cells that work together for a related function, right? So, it's a bunch of cells that are doing a certain job together, right? Certain cell types that are doing a related job. And so there are actually 4 primary tissue types, that each of these tissue types have similar cells that have a certain related function. So I'll tell you what that general related function is. And then in each of these, we're going to explore them one by one. And we're going to see subtypes of tissue, right? So these are the primary tissue types. The first one is called an epithelial tissue. Epi, if you recall, means on top of, right? Epi means on top of. So these are tissues. Do you see over here? This is probably skin. And you see over here a bunch of cells over here, a thick layer of these purplish cells. Underneath is connective tissue, but here this is an epithelial tissue with a bit of layer of keratin on top. So this is skin probably, and you have this epithelium and you have this empty space over here, right? This is epithelial. It's a tissue that is epi on top. It's a top layer, right? So it's tissues that cover surfaces, right? Like skin. This whole layer over here is a layer that is covering on top, such as your skin. It could also, however, be lining cavities or different tubes in your body. So, for instance, all your digestive tract, right, from the mouth all the way to the rear end, you have epithelial tissue that lines that tube. Or even in your trachea that goes down to the depths of the lung, you'll have this little epithelium on top, lining cavities, right, lining blood vessels, or even forming some glands. We'll see that that could be epithelial tissue. But the main thing here to note is epithelial tissue, usually what we think about is these covering and lining types of tissue. I'm going to skip connective tissue for a minute. Muscle tissue is, do you see these? This is one big muscle cell, 2, 3. These are long cells with contractile proteins in it. There's these bands in it. And muscle tissue in general allows movement. So these types of cells go inwards and outwards. So they allow the cell to get smaller and bigger. So you think of a muscle that's contracting and relaxing, it needs to be able to have this range of motion, right? You don't see that in epithelial tissue. So, that's why I'm saying there's similar cells and a related function. These are really lining and covering and protective, right? These muscle tissues are contractile and they're very useful for muscles, right? Nervous tissue, these weird alien looking cells here, these are called neurons, and you have neuroglial cells all around. We're going to talk about that in a bit. These are their function, right? You could think of them mostly in the brain and spinal cord, but there are also peripheral nerves going out and about to our tissues. Nervous tissue send electrical signals to communicate throughout the body, right? So these little cells, they send electrical cells. Basically, nervous tissue is allowing us to send signals to different regions. And lastly, best for the last, is connective tissue. Why did I finish with connective tissue? Because it's kind of the garbage can of tissues. Whatever we don't know where to categorize it, if it's not aligning, if it's not contracting, if it's not sending signals, then we throw it in this weird garbage bin category of everything else, right? So connective tissue, it's a bit of a stretch, but we can say that connective tissue connects things together and fills spaces in the body. I like to think of it as the super glue of the body. Okay, so think of like over here, for instance, you see this epithelium on top. Underneath is all this connective tissue that's anchoring down the epithelium, right? If we didn't have connective tissue, everything would kind of fall apart. We need something to anchor skin down. We need something to keep an organ in place, right? And to anchor it in the body. We'll talk about how different connective tissues, what different types we have, but that's the general categories that we have. So these four primary tissues interweave to form the fabric of the body. Um, I want to make a point, and I think I made it in our first lecture. An organ, right, is not made of just one or two tissue types. It is made of all of these. Remember that when we piece together many tissues, right, we form an organ. So, for example, the stomach has a lining that is an epithelium. It has an outer layer that is three outer layers of muscle that contract. It has nervous tissue to send signals to contract and to send signals up when it's stretched. It has connective tissue to piece all of this together. So an organ is really a combination of all four of these, right? So they make the fabric of our body, specifically organs and then organisms, as we saw in the hierarchy in the first lecture. So each of the four primary tissues also has many subtypes, right? Over here, you see epithelial tissue has a bunch of subtypes, muscular tissue has a bunch of others, connective tissue here, nervous tissue under. We're going to explore all of these. All right, so over here, we're going to start with epithelial tissue. The main thing that you want to know for epithelial tissue is that these are sheets of tightly packed cells that are on one end lining a boundary, and on the other, there's an open space, right? So we often talk about them covering and lining things, right? So, for example, here you see skin. Do you see these cells here? You see the darker nuclei, right, that are in the cells? They're covering, this is the open space that I'm talking about. This is like on top of the skin, right? And this, all of this here, right, is the epithelium that is lining the skin. This is like inside the body. This is on the outside over here, right, on top of the skin. So skin, right, you see these nice tightly packed cells. We'll talk about the fact that underneath it you have another type of tissue, but over here, do you see these cells over here that are in the trachea, right? So I want you to imagine, actually, let me draw it here. The trachea, right, is like a tube, right? And you actually have some more cells over here on this side that are tightly packed. Okay, so they have their little nuclei. So these are the cells on this side. These are the cells on this side, right? You see these cells. And over here in the middle is like the open space that I talked about where air passes down, right? This comes from up in your mouth. You bring in air and it goes down into this region. Well, here you have these cells that are lining that tube, that tract, right? So here you also see a covering, epi. It's on top and it's covering that tract. So these are nicely tightly packed cells here. They actually have little hairs. We'll talk about the little hairs that are over here later on. Glands, okay, this is a bit weird. For glands, right, I need you to imagine grapes, right? I need you to imagine maybe a few little grapes in a grape stack, right? And I want you to imagine that we cut those grapes, right? That we cut them, uh, that grap of grapes in two, right? If you would look down at those grapes that you just cut the whole bunch of grapes, cut that grap in two, you would see many circles of the grapes, right? Well, that's what you're seeing here. Glands are like a bunch of grapes and they squeeze their substances into the grapes and they come out of a duct, right? They come out this duct over here, maybe the stem of all the grap of grapes, right? So they make secretions that they secrete into these areas that will go out a duct. So here when you cut the let's say I cut the grapes like this, which is what we see under a microscope, right? You cut the grapes like this, you will see this view, right? So you see actually like this little grape here, right? And this little grape over here and this one. And you see an epithelium, you see a blank space in the middle. That's where the secretions are put in. That's the open space, right? But aligning it, do you see all of these little nuclei here? They're lining the inside of the gland, right? And they're actually creating the secretions and putting them into this empty space here. So that's your glands. That's also made up of these epithelial tissue like we saw. It's just that when you look at it under the microscope, it looks weird because you have different pockets. But that's just because of when you do histology, when you look at tissues, you chop a certain way, right? And you just see the 2D picture. Over here, ducts and tubules, right? Think of like tubules that are maybe carrying urine in the kidneys, right? If you chop this in two, right? Again, you see the little grapes here, right? You see these, maybe there's tubes that are going up and down like this. And if you chop it like this, then you're gonna see this part of the tube, this part of the tube, this part of the tube, and this one, right? Well, that's the circles that you're seeing over here, right? And I want you to look inside. There's these cells that are lining the tubules like this, right? You see these epithelial cells lining the tubules. So those are all, again, I just want to re-emphasize the main point here. Epithelial tissue, all of these, they're sheets of tightly packed cells. They're very close together on a boundary next to an open space, right? They're lining things, right? Or in glands, they're making secretions, but they're lining that whole portion of the gland, right? So that's kind of the idea for epithelial tissues. So epithelial tissue, right? I for each of these, I put one verb, okay? Sometimes in biology, it's easy to get confused. So just think of one specific verb that comes to mind when you think of epithelium, right? And here I wrote covering, covers, right? Epithelial tissue covers things. It could be a surface epithelium. We'll see simple squamous ones, simple columnar, pseudostratified, stratified, squamous. And then over here, glandular epithelium. That's like endocrine glands or exocrine glands. We're going to see these two subtypes of epithelial tissue. Okay. So what are the general functions of epithelial tissue? Well, as I said, there's two subtypes. So for the surface epithelium, the ones that are covering and lining, they provide protection and a physical barrier, right? These, think of things like skin, right? They actually prevent mechanical stresses from hurting and entering into the blood system, right? Think of when we get a cut and we breach the skin. Bacteria could get in, so microorganisms could get in, right? It could actually harm our body if it's too deep, right? It protects us from hot and cold also, right? So our skin, for instance, it contains all of our body heat inside. And if we get too hot, it allows us to sweat it out. If it's too cold, it keeps heat in, right? So it actually is a physical barrier. Covering and lining epithelium also regulate transport. So uh, they are selectively permeable. They allow absorption of certain things. So, for instance, in the small intestine, we have epithelium that allows for absorption and uptake of certain nutrients, right? Um, Sometimes it's excretion. Some epithelium, like the ones in the kidneys, allow us to excrete and release wastes out into the urine, so it allows us to exchange, right, and transport things across the epithelium. And then filtration, right? Some epithelium separate substances and keep some or excrete out others. That's called filtration, to allow certain things to come in but not others. You filter out what you want. Epithelium also allows sensations with nervous tissue. So some sensations, like for example, touch, right, involves the epithelium and the nervous tissue. Because once you sense something in the epithelium, you need to transmit it to the brain or to the nervous system. So with nervous tissue, we're actually able to sense things. So in the epithelium, at times, you'll have these little receptors that are able to feel things, such as skin, like I said. Um, this was all our surface epithelium, and we're going to see these subtypes over here. But now the glandular epithelium, right? What is a gland? It's something that produces secretions, right? Via glands. So this is an example of a gland. You see the epithelial lining again. These cells here, though, they actually produce something. And this something is called a secretion. Something that gets secreted out, right? That's made by glands. What is it that can be secreted out? Sweat from a sweat gland can be made in these glands and then secreted outside onto our skin surface, and we become sticky and gross. Saliva could be made in glands and secreted out into the ducts from our salivary glands into our mouth, right? Milk could be made like in the breasts, right? There's the ability for lactation because these glands are making milk and secreting them out. Oil, right? In the hair follicle, there's what we call sebaceous glands, and they actually have little glands that make a substance called sebum. This is a type of oil, and that's what makes our hair oily. If you don't wash it a few days, it gets all oily. That's glands in our hair follicles. Enzymes, right? Some glands make a bunch of enzymes for the digestive system to break down. So we'll see some of these digestive enzymes in the pancreas, for instance. They make some secretions and they'll put it out. Hormones, a lot of hormones we'll talk about. The glands that are there, they will make the hormone and secrete it out. Mucus, too, right? So I gave you a bunch of examples, right? That's not really the point. The point is to just say that glandular epithelium glands, right, are also made of epithelial tissue. You see these tightly packed cells, and they make secretions that they expulse out onto a surface or inside the body somewhere. So epithelia in general, right? Um, Epithelia forms the boundaries that separate us from the outside world, right? That's what the covering and lining ones do. Nearly all substances that the body gives off or that it receives need to pass through some kind of an epithelium, right? So it's important. Epithelial tissue is very important. All epithelial tissue, right? All of them have certain characteristics that I want to talk about. So the first characteristics is that epithelial cells are tightly bound by what I call desmosomes. So over here, you see that these desmosomes, they attach cells together and they form a continuous sheet with no space between the cells. It's like a brick wall, right? You see that these bricks are tightly bound by cement and there's no gaps. Like you can't peek into this brick wall over here because over here there's cement, here there's desmosomes. They're anchoring proteins that are linking together the two cells, right? And there's no space between the cells. So all epithelium are tightly bound. It's not easy peasy to get through. The deepest layer of epithelial cells are anchored to the basement membrane. Do you see this over here? All epithelium lie on a basement membrane. I'm going to repeat this over and over. All layers of epithelium lie on this basement membrane. This is important. This is the base that it's sitting on, right? So over here, this basement membrane, you don't see it here, but there's actually hemidesmosomes, half desmosomes, that anchor these cells down to the basement membrane, okay? So desmosomes in general, they link things together, right? They actually link two cells together, but a half desmosome, a hemidesmosome, will link these cells down to the basement membrane. And all epithelium have some kind of a free surface on one side. So over here, let's say, is the free surface where you have, like, as I said here on your skin, it could be just this over here. This is the environment, the free surface, right? But it could also be like a tube, right? Like if the epithelium is going around in a circle in a tube, right? Then the inside of the tube is what the free surface is, right? Like I'm thinking the digestive system, the intestine, right? This is all a free surface, and there's an epithelium that lines around the small intestine. So there's a free surface on one side, or an edge exposed to the body's exterior, right? Or the cavity or an organ. Like think of if you're in the stomach, there's an epithelium around there, right? So next point is that all epithelium are avascular, right? What does it mean to be avascular? So in a word in biology, if ever you see an A in front of it, it means not. Okay, so for example, asexual means not sexual, right? Avascular means not vascular. So over here, what does vascular mean? Vasculature, right? Vessels, it sounds like, right? Avascular means no blood vessels. So actually, if you look in here, you see all the blood vessels below in this connective tissue, but it's not up here in this epithelium, in this epithelial tissue up here, right? You see blood vessels down here, however. So avascular means that there's no blood vessels. You never find blood vessels in an epithelium. Also, epithelial are innervated, right? Nerve is a word in here. Innervated means to send a nerve there. There contains little nerves in between the epithelium. So we say the epithelium is innervated with neurons, with nerves, right? There are little neurons that go here. Remember I told you that you could touch your skin, right? And you could feel things. Well, that means there must be some nerves over here to feel that, right? The other thing, you know how I said here it's avascular, no blood vessels? If I scratch right now my skin, I see like cells kind of like scrape, right? But there's no blood coming out. I actually need to scrape a little stronger, or actually have a cut to see blood, right? So when you cut yourself and you see blood, that's because you reached this connective tissue layer. You actually pierced through the epithelium and got to the connective tissue. But the epithelium itself doesn't have. If not, if I scraped my skin here, I would see blood come out right away. So epithelium has no blood vessels, but does have nerves. And it rests on a connective tissue. All epithelium rests on a basement membrane, and underneath that is the connective tissue, okay? So remember, this was another type of category of tissues, right? Connective tissue is that super glue. So it's the super glue that holds the epithelium down. So this is important. Because remember I told you that all cells of the body need access to blood. If they do not have access to the stuff in the blood, then they will die, they will necrose, these cells will not survive, right? So over here, this connective tissue is essential because all the blood vessels, right, they're very close to the epithelium, and these blood vessels, right, are able to transmit nutrients and oxygen up to these cells of the epithelium, and remove waste. When these cells make waste like CO2, it takes the CO2 and it puts it back into the blood and removes it, right? So it's essential that the connective tissue is vascularized and it's close to the epithelium because it needs to provide these tissues, these on top, the epithelium, with blood, right? If there is no blood going there to, for some reason there's a blockage here and there's no blood going to these cells, right, close to these cells, then these cells will die, right? We need to feed all tissues of our body with these things. I know that the epithelium doesn't have blood vessels in it, but it's right underneath blood vessels, and so the oxygen and nutrients could diffuse up and feed the cells very easily. So it's not too bad. So that's good. That's important. And cells, right, they regenerate rapidly. This is something these epithelium that I want you to know. If these are protective layers, right, you actually have these cells that can divide very rapidly. We saw cell division in the previous lecture. These cells could divide very quickly, which means that they can be replaced, right? Because let's say skin over here, that, right now I just scratch and I see like the little scrapings, right? The cells are coming off of our skin, right? Actually, all the dust that's in our house is, unless you have an animal with you in your house, it's pretty much you that's sloughing off all of these epithelial cells constantly. So they need to be replaced often. They rapidly divide compared to other cells. So this is important for epithelial tissues. So all epithelial tissues, no matter what we talk about, these are some common characteristics that they have. So looking at this question here, in the following images of the epithelial tissue, identify the following features if present. So the epithelium, the free surface, the basement membrane, and the connective tissue. So I want you to pause the video and try to answer those questions. All right, so first thing, I want you to be able, here you see some skin, I want you to be able to find the epithelium. Remember, these are tightly packed cells, right? And in the skin, for instance, they're stopping things from entering and exiting. So do you see all of these little nuclei? These are cells that are making a multi-layered structure. This epithelium is multi-layered and it's protecting. Here on top you have a bit of keratin. We'll talk about that later on. That's just some of these dead cells that are on the top layer. It still counts as the epithelium. So here I would choose all of this keratin here, and even all of this area, right? All of this is some of the epithelium here. Remember that on one side of the epithelium is the free surface, right? So over here you see this free surface that's on top, right? And on the other side of the epithelium, right, is connective tissue. Underneath the epithelium is connective tissue. Do you see how this layer here is not as packed tightly? It looks different than the epithelial layer on top. That's because this layer underneath is the connective tissue, full of blood vessels, right, to feed the epithelium on top. So all of this here, all this stuff is the connective tissue underneath. And remember that the basement membrane, right, it is that little segment that splits the epithelium from the connective tissue. You don't really see it here, but I'm going to pretend to draw at where it would be, right? This is where, oops, let's put that in this color. So that would be right lining over here between the epithelium on top and the connective tissue underneath, right? So that's the basement membrane. Here, the basement membrane is kind of like this, okay? And as I said, you're gonna have this epithelium on top. So all of this, oops, let's go back. Let's go here. All of this up here is the epithelium. And these cells have little hairs on top even. We'll talk about those. And they face, so one of the sides is going to be the free surface. The other one is going to be the connective tissue, right? Here in the skin, the free surface is like this over here, right? And if we punctured in, we'd be puncturing in this way and going into the skin. If you start bleeding in your skin, that's because you've punctured deep enough to get to these blood vessels in the connective tissue here, right? This is in the trachea, right? The little hairs, cells here. And so all of this is the epithelium, right? The free surface is over here. This is where the air will pass, right? This is air is going down here. It's not entering the body, it's going down. And then underneath the basement membrane is where we would find this over here. This is connective tissue. It's more loosely packed, right? It's a little bit different. In our ducts, right? Remember what I told you. You have these secretions, right? These are like glands, right? Let's say a sweat gland. These cells here, right? The cells in the ducts, they make, let's say, their substance like sweat. They secrete it out here into the free space, and then it goes up the pore and it will exit out onto the skin, right? This would be the skin surface. So that's like a gland, right? And if we cut the gland like this, then you would see the little circles, right, that make up the gland. And that's what you're seeing here. Do you see these circles that are the little parts where the gland is making substances? So over here, right, my basement membrane, actually, this is a little bit strange. I'm going to start with the free surface. The free surface, right, is anywhere where you see white, where there's nothing. So all of this, oops, I'm going to change my color. This is my free surface. This is my free surface inside, right? That's where the secretions would be put. Let's say it's a sweat gland, it's sweat. If it's, let's say, sebaceous gland that makes oil, right? Then the oil would go over here inside. So that is our free space. And the cells that are actually making this substance, right, are called the epithelial cells. These are the epithelial cells over here that line. Do you see they're distinct cells that are tightly packed together, right? So this is all my epithelium here. My epithelium here too, right? And over here is my epithelium. And then over here, you would have the connective tissue, right? This is a bit weird. The connective tissue would be all around these ducts, right? Like this. And so this is all of the connective tissue that would be kind of around these areas, right? So you would have all of this. Okay, so that's how our glands would look. And I think we're good with that. Oh, sorry, I forgot the basement membrane. So let me get out this over here. Between the epithelium and the connective tissue is still a basement membrane. So I'm going to draw it like this, right? This is where our basement membrane would be at the bottom over here, right? Right over here. Perfect. Good. All right. So moving on now. How do we classify epithelium? right? I showed you there's different in the skin and ducts and glands, but how do we classify these epithelium? Structurally, humans have 8 main types of epithelial tissues, and most are named based off of a 2-word system. So the first word indicates one or more layers of cells. The second word indicates the cell's shape. Okay, so the first word is the number of cell layers. For example, over here, it could be either simple or stratified that you put as the first word. Okay, so simple, if you put simple in the name, that means it's simply one cell layer. Okay, stratified means multiple cell layers. It means that, like, I like to think of stratified like the clouds. Stratus clouds are like all they're kind of spread out, right? The stratus clouds, they're very spread out, and they're kind of longer clouds, right? So stratified means multiple layers, or a stratified layer of rocks, right? Many layers. That's multiple cell layers. Um, so that's going to be your first word. Look here. This is called simple squamous epithelium. Simple is the first word because it's one layer of these. Simple cuboidal, it's one layer of cubes. Simple columnar, it's one layer, right? Here it's stratified. So stratified squamous, many stratified because there's many layers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, right? Here's stratified because there's these 2 layers over here that you see. It's more than one, right? And stratified here, you see 2 layers also. It's more than one. So the first word that you put in the naming is either simple or it's stratified, depending on if it's one layer or more than one layer. The second word you use is cell shape. Okay, so the second word you use is how it looks. This is called squamous. These are flat looking cells. There's a little bump because the nucleus takes up a bit of space. These flat cells, right? I like to call them not flat, but squishy cells. It sounds like squamous, squishy, squamous. These are squishy cells, right? So they're flat. So here you see a simple squamous epithelium because it's simply one layer, and it's squamous, it's squishy cells, right? They're flat. Here you have stratified squamous because you have multiple layers stratified, but then they're squishy cells, right? They look a little bit squishy. And even sometimes we need to look at only the top layer to determine. Here they look a bit more cuboidal. Here they look a bit more squishy. So sometimes we look at the top layer. So that's for the squamous cells. Cuboidal, it says it in its name. It's cube-like, right? So this is a simple cuboidal. Simple because it's simply one layer. Cuboidal because they're cube-shaped. This is stratified cuboidal, however, because there's more than one layer and it's cube-like cells, okay? Columnar is the word we use for tall and narrow epithelium. So this is like a column, right? It's like a column is like like the big columns, right, that are going, pillars that are holding up a building, right? These are the columns over here. Their height is they're taller than their width, right? So they're like a rectangle. They're not a cube. So simple columnar, it's simply one layer of column-like cells. So they are columns. They are these rectangles, these big rectangles. And stratified columnar, they are more than one layer, and they are column-like cells, right? So that's how we name. These are the main types that we name. So simple or stratified for the first word, and then the cell shape for the second word, right? There's some exceptions, as always. We have exceptions, something that's called pseudo-stratified columnar. We're going to see a type of tissue that has this pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium. This is pseudo means fake, right? Pseudoscience is fake science, people making up these weird conspiracy theories, right? Pseudo means not real. Stratified means multiple stratified layers, right? So there's many layers. So it's fake uh, multiple layers, right? It's not really multiple layers. Pseudo, not really. Stratified. It's not really stratified. So why do we say this? So these are layers that have a single layer of cells. Do you see how this is one layer? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You have these 6 cells and they're all in one line, right? So there's one cell touching here, one. There's one layer of cells, but the cells have different heights. And so look at this nuclei is higher, this one's lower, higher, lower. This looks like it's stratified because the nuclei are at different heights. And if you don't see the border properly, you actually don't know, right? But it's actually, this is actually a single layer. It's simple, actually, but it looks like it's stratified. It's pseudo. It's a wannabe stratified, right? So layers have a single layer of cells of different heights, right? They're different heights. Transitional epithelium have the capacity for excessive stretching. So these are interesting. You actually see these cuboidal cells on top, right? And these wonky cells on the bottom. This is a stratified layer, and we're going to see this in the bladder. In the bladder, when the bladder is relaxed, right, the cells look nice and cuboidal, right? And then when the bladder expands, it pushes the walls, and these cells over here get thinner and thinner, and they will create these more squamous looking cells. So these cells could transition between cuboidal and squamous depending on how full the bladder is. That's called the transitional epithelium. It's a stratified layer that could transition in terms of its cell shape. So now let's go through the types, these types. We name them. I just want us to picture something. I want to go back over here. The epithelial tissue, right? These covering tissues are broken down into these surface epithelium. So simple squamous, simple columnar. We're going to look at these, right? And then glandular, we'll talk about them. But I want you to understand that these are subtypes, right? These over here are subtypes, ways that we classify epithelial tissue. All of these are epithelium, right? But there are subtypes of them. All right. So let's go through the first type, simple squamous epithelium. So over here, this is a simple layer because it's a single layer. It's simply one layer. And it's squamous because these are squishy cells, right? They're small, they're flat. The function of these we're going to discuss now. Okay, here's the deal. Remember what I told you at the beginning. Structure equals function. What this tissue looks like reflects very much what it does, right? If I come to work and I have a hammer and nails and a screwdriver and a helmet, right? Then I'm most likely ready to be a construction worker, and I'm going to do that. I'm not going to necessarily be teaching or be a dentist, right? So what you look like, what your tissue looks like, reflects its function. So the function of this tissue, right, is that it allows certain substances to easily pass through by diffusion. This is a very thin layer, right? So things like respiratory gases can easily pass through to the other side and they can exchange across this. It's not too bad to diffuse through, right? This is most definitely not a protective layer. The function of this layer would not be protection. It's thin, right? Imagine your skin was this thin. That wouldn't be good. Things would easily get through, bacteria and viruses. So actually, this is going to be in certain regions, in the air sacs of the lungs, the alveoli, and also in capillary blood vessels. Why would you have these layers in these specific places? Because these are regions where you'd want to exchange things across the membrane, right? We're not protecting in these areas. We're going to actually be wanting to exchange. So I want to give you an example of this, right? This is an example of a layer of simple squamous cells lining the air sacs of the lungs where diffusion of gases occur, right? In the lungs, right, you have the lungs kind of end and they form these grapes, as I said, right? Like at the ends of the lung bronchi, you have these grapes. And if you cut the grapes, remember that you see these little sacs, right? These are the air sacs that fill up full of air. And so, right, in these air sacs, right, you're going to be next to blood vessels. Like here's a little blood vessel, let's say, and here's an air sac. So air comes down over here and then it will enter into a little blood vessel, right? It needs to cross this thin layer, right? Air needs to be able to exchange. So it's very good that we have a thin layer, this simple squamous epithelium that is lining the inside. Now, I know some of you will say, this is 2 layers, or this looks like 2 over here, or whatever. It's not perfect, right? And secondly, like the way you cut the tissue and you see it under the microscope might look different depending on what you're looking at. So I know all of you are looking at this little cartoon here. Sorry, you're looking at this real tissue and you're saying this doesn't look anything like what you're showing here, right? Of course, this is the real deal, right? And the way you cut or the way it's stained might look a little different. So you need to just you need to imagine a little bit sometimes and be okay with ambiguity. Okay, so here I'm just gonna pretend like, you know, here you have one sac and here's another one, right? And you see this one layer, and here you see simple cells. They're not thick, right? They're not cubes. They're thin, they're squishy. There's one layer ish, right? So this is a simple squamous epithelium. So this is a single squished cell layer that makes it ideal for the smallest distances for diffusion across the membrane, right? We're able to diffuse across this membrane. Identification tips when you're looking at this under the microscope, right? Cells are three-dimensional and organs are three-dimensional. This is, as I said, like tubes or sacs, right? Like let's say I have my blood vessel here, right? When I chop the blood vessel like this, right, I'm going to see in 2 dimensions this over here. And I'm going to see my little squishy cells lining like this. It's going to look 2-dimensional, right? So it's going to look like a circle if I cut this. Or let me just remind you, like when you have a gland like this, or sorry, not a gland, when you have these alveoli over here, I told you that they're like little pockets, little grapes at the bottom, right? When you cut the little grapes, right, and you look down at it, you're gonna see these little circles like this in 2 dimension, right? So one identification tip for you is, even though you see like this doesn't look like a lung, right? This is lung tissue, right? And it's cut in 2 dimensions. So that's why you're seeing this. In the lungs over here, you would see these pockets because there's many little alveoli, okay? So I told you over here that there's air sacs, right, that you would see over here. I also told you capillary blood vessels. So I want to show you over here layers of simple squamous epithelium that lines the lumen of a vein, right? A vein is a type of blood vessel. It's a type of blood vessel that will carry blood, right? And I really like this picture because here you see these nice squishy cells, right? They're thin, they're squishy, they're lining this lumen. A lumen is something you can shine a lumière in, a light. It's a tube. The inside of a tube is called a lumen. So this is the lumen of the blood vessel, right? And inside of it, right, you see, what do you see here? You see these little circles, these discs, right? These are red blood cells, right? It's very cool. This little venule here is this little blood vessel has a bunch of red blood cells in it that you can see stained. So, all this to say, right, here's a blood vessel, right, that has some red blood cells. Here's the lumen, and you see a simple squamous epithelium. All this other crap out here, right, all of this stuff is just connective tissue, right? It's that connective tissue, or maybe another little blood vessel over here. So it's all the other stuff, but you do see a nice blood vessel here. It's not pretty. It's not like the textbook image because our bodies are not the textbook, right? Our textbook simplifies things a lot. We need to remember that when we look at histology, when we look at tissues, these cuts are done they're done on a three-dimensional organ, and you only see 2 dimensions when you look at it, right? So this is like, okay, so here's like you have the trachea over here, and then it goes into bronchi and then bronchioles. Here are the little grapes I talked about where gas exchange occurs. And do you see how these little vessels, these blood vessels, circle around the little grapes, right? That's because if I zoom in over here to the one little grape, this is the inside of the grape, and air goes down all the way here, right, into this yellow part. Air comes down all the way here, and on the other side, around the grapes, are all these little, you see these red and blue little blood vessels, right? So air exchanges between the little red and blue vessels and the air that's inside the actual alveoli. So here, these are called alveoli in the depths of the lung. And you have our blood vessels that wrap around so that air can go in and out into our blood, okay? And so you kind of have 2 epithelium here. You have epithelium, this simple squamous epithelium around the blood vessels. You see that over here. And then you have around the alveoli, right? You see this simple squamous epithelium. And you're going to tell me this one looks like a square, or this one looks, when it's a cuboidal, you will know. You will see these perfect squares. These are small, they're squishy, they seem like one layer, right? So these are simple squamous epithelium that line here it's the air sacs, and here it's a blood vessel. Let me go to the next one. I think we skip simple cuboidal because we don't really care about that one. I'm going to go on to simple columnar epithelium. This is a single layer of tall cells. It's one layer of these very tall cells that are taller than they are wide. Simple, one layer, columnar, column-like. And their function is interesting. They secrete certain substances. They're bigger than the simple squishy cells. The squishy cells really don't make much, right? They're just lining there, and they're a tiny barrier, and they allow things through. This one actually has a big nucleus, right? It has a bunch of organelles probably because there's lots of space here. And so they actually could make stuff, right? Some of them make secretions like goblet cells that make mucus. So you're actually going to have some of these epithelium that'll have some goblet cells that make things like mucus. Some of them will have these little microvilli at the top, these little brushes, we call them. Those are microvilli that are important for absorption. So I'm going to get there in a second. Give me a second. I just want you to understand, this one's a bit harder to understand, but these are a single layer of bigger cells, right? They're not really the best at protecting because it's not multiple layers, but also they're bigger. So what they do is they have a bigger ability to process stuff, to have enzymes, to bring in stuff, right, to make proteins. So they have a bit more of a complex function than just the simple squamous epithelium. I'm going to talk about the functions in a minute. I just want to talk about where you could find these simple columnar epithelium. We could find it in the stomach, in the small intestines, and in the small intestines they have these little microvilli we'll talk about in a minute. And in the large intestines you find these. So, over here, I'll give you the example of the layer of simple columnar cells with microvilli, with these little ups and downs, these brush borders, that line the lumen, the inside of the small intestines, because it helps with absorption of nutrients. Here's the deal. Again, structure equals function. The way it looks is often what it does, okay? So here in the small intestines, you have these little finger-like projections that go up and down, up and down. These are called villi, okay? If you zoom in, okay, to the villi, let's say you zoom in over here and you look at the cells that are here, right? This is what you would see. You would see these ups and downs, and there's these little cells over here that are columnar, right? These columnar cells, they're the size of a column, right? They're taller. And if you look at it, right, you see over here, it's not the best picture, but there are little protrusions that go up and down, up and down. The actual cell membrane, right? The actual cell membrane goes up and down, up and down. So here, remember, these are phospholipids, right? You have these little phospholipid bilayers that go like this, right? And they go on and on. They continue the little phospholipid membranes, right? And they go around like this, all around those intestinal cells. So it's the actual membrane of these cells that go up and down, right? They have these shapes. And so that is interesting. You barely see it over here, but these are truly little villi. They look like just a little hue on top, but they are like this. They go up and down. They are these microvilli, because the villi are the ups and downs inside the small intestine. There's actually a rugged surface, but if you look at one of the cells, one cell has also these ups and downs. It's a bit trippy, right? So what is this useful for, right? In the small intestine, let me draw something over here. Here's my small intestine, right? If I cut the small intestine, it's like this. I have ups and downs like this because, right? And even the cells over here, these little cells have ups and downs. They have these microvilli like this, right? Because if I had something that was flat, right? And you know that the function of the small intestine is to absorb different nutrients, right? It brings in nutrients into the body. So if I had a cell that was flat like this, and here's my small intestine, right, over here, and food was going down this tube this way, food could be, this little food particle could be absorbed into the body here, 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 or here, right? And it would go in and it would go into the body, right? It would be absorbed. If instead, right, my cell looks like this and it has, let me actually just erase all this. If my cell instead is like this, right, and here's my, now my lumen of my small intestine, right? Here's my small intestine. Food could be absorbed over here, over here, over here, over here, over here, 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 and on and on and on, right? Do you see how when you increase the amount of plasma membrane, there's actually more of a region where food could be brought into the cell? So cells that absorb things into the body, right? Such as the cells of the small intestine, you actually have these microvilli, these small little villi up and down, right? These finger-like projections of the plasma membrane that bring in stuff into the body, right? So this is very good. This helps in the small intestine to absorb things. Sometimes, right, you have goblet cells. Do you see these pale cells here? This is a cell, goblet cell. They're pale because the mucus is a bit fatty and it doesn't get stained by the dyes that are hydrophilic. They're fatty, so they don't bind to the dyes. Instead, so these are full of mucus and they secrete mucus, right? Think of the small intestine. You actually secrete a lot of mucus into the small intestine to allow things to pass nicely, right? Mucus is can help lubricate a little bit the passage. So that's another cell type you might see mixed into this simple columnar epithelium. So all this to say, maybe I confused us a little bit, but what I wanted to get to was that when you have a simple columnar epithelium, simple means there's a single layer. So it makes the distance of diffusion and absorption easy. In the small intestine, we need to absorb things in. If it was thick layer stratified, that wouldn't be good. We wouldn't be able to absorb our food well, and we'd have malabsorption. They're larger cells compared to these simple squamous, right? These are much bigger because they contain more structures to produce the secretions, right? Maybe certain enzymes or saliva if they're in a gland, right? So this over here, right? They're bigger cells because they make enzymes and they actually have a function that is important. And they have these microvilli that make their plasma membrane even larger. They have a bigger surface area, right? This is key over here. This point here, microvilli are in the small intestine. They have these ups and downs because that increases their surface area. There's a bigger surface area on top of their cells, which could increase the amount that they absorb, right? So cells that do absorbing will have these microvilli to help them take in as much as they can, right? And this is really in the small intestine that we see this. Next cell that I want to show you, I don't really like this picture. Actually, I wish that instead of this, I could put these, try to put like little hairs, right? This I call little fingers because it's actually a part of the cell. But these are actually little hairs that are over here. Think of a brush, right? The brush and the hairs on top are a bit different than the stick that holds it. So we'll talk about that in a second. These are pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Pseudo want to be stratified, right? Because they are actually one layer of cells, if you look at it, but they're pseudo. They have their nuclei at different heights, so they look like they're a single layer. They look like they're multiple layers, right? Look, this is a real pseudo-stratified layer. It looks like many layers because of the nuclei, but it's not, right? All of the nuclei are just at different heights, so it gives it a wannabe stratified layer. And so characteristics, they're a single layer that touches the basement membrane, but some of the cells are shorter than others, right? So here's a very long one, here's a short one. So that's what it looks like. It's a wannabe layer of that wants to be stratified, but it's not actually. What is the function of this? This one is going to be for protection and secretion. This is found in the nasal cavity and in the trachea. And in these locations, right, we actually are exposed to a lot of germs, right, and viruses and bacteria. So we actually want to get rid of all these bad things. And so these little hairs here, I don't like that they look the same as this. They aren't. These are actually little hairs on top. They beat in a certain direction. They do not absorb, okay? They're beating and moving debris in a certain direction. I think I have a picture here. Do you see these beating cilia? They're moving stuff. So they are moving junky stuff, all the bad bacteria and that away. And also secretion. As I showed you in the in the small intestine, there's these paler cells called goblet cells, and they secrete mucus. They secrete it in the lumen over here, and they trap microbes, bacteria, viruses, dust, and then the cilia beat it away, right? So these are the cells, the goblet cells. They look like a goblet, right? I want you to see its shape, and maybe that'll help you a bit. This looks like a little goblet, right? An upside down goblet, and it is making all of this mucus that it's putting into the lumen over here in the open space, and it's trapping bad stuff. So that's the function of these layers in the nasal cavity and the trachea. So this is a layer of pseudostratified columnar epithelium, right? With beating cilia. The cilia are beating, and mucus producing goblet cells. And the goal of all of this is to protect the respiratory tract, right? So the goblet cells, these are producing and secreting a sticky substance that's called mucus, and that traps debris. Cilia, right, is the little hairs on top, the projections at the top of the cells that beat and to move the trapped dust and microbes in the mucus away from the lungs. So they beat to get it away. And we don't really care too much about these. At the bottom, you have these little triangle cells. These are regenerative cells. They're stem cells that make up the new cells on top. So they're the baby cells, the stem cells. So basically, the main takeaway is these pseudostratified, they have cilia at the top that beat. They do not absorb things, right? This is not microvilli. Microvilli is in the intestines to absorb things. Cilia are on these cells, the pseudostratified columnar epithelium, and they are just there to beat and push things along. And the mucus goblet cells, they produce the goblet cells produce mucus, and both of these together, they protect the respiratory tract, right? So the identification tip here is that nuclei are at different heights, right? So it looks pseudo-stratified. So if you take a look at a picture here, if I look at the trachea here and I cut out a piece and I looked at it, this is what you would see. You see these fine little hairs, right, that are over here, and they're beating. Do you see it beat like this, right? So in the trachea, you see these single layer of epithelial cells that appear stratified. You see that it looks like multiple layers, right? But it's not. It's actually one layer all on the basement membrane here. And between them, you see these kind of lighter colored cells. These are full of mucus. Mucus doesn't stain. Mucus is fatty, and it doesn't stain. It doesn't mix with water. It's fat, right? It's just like oil. And so it doesn't stain with the dyes that like watery stuff, okay? So between them, you see these mucus-filled cells. Here you see the mucus. These make the mucus, trap the stuff, and then the cilia brush it. So I want you to know the difference, that the goblet cells make mucus. That's to stick and trap its sticky mucus, right? So it traps the stuff, and then the cilia brush that mucus away with the bad stuff, and it brushes it up, right? Only in one direction. It brushes all of that bad stuff up to your esophagus, and actually you swallow it into your esophagus, and it goes to your stomach and gets burnt alive. So that's our pseudostratified. Now we go on to our stratified squamous epithelium. This is stratified, meaning multi-layered, squamous, flat cells, especially the top ones. So you always look at the top ones and see that they're flat, and that's how you know they're squamous. At the bottom, they might look a bit more cuboidal. And what is this for? This is not one layer, right? So this is not really worried about diffusion and stuff like that. The main function of this is protection. You want to protect from abrasion, like friction. You want to protect from microbes, right? Uh, if this is your skin, let's say, right, microbes, they need to really work hard to try to get through into your skin. It's much harder for them, and it's actually uh, quite impossible for them to get all the way in. Um, Protect from dirt and chemicals, right? So this is a great protection. You have two types of these epithelium. Some are keratinized. They have a keratin layer on top, which is we're gonna see it's this tough layer, and it actually helps us prevent from water loss. Or some are non-keratinized. Any opening into the body, such as the mouth, the esophagus, the anus, or the vaginal canal, all of those are non-keratinized. You If you touch the outside skin, right, and you touch inside your mouth, it feels different, right? There's kind of this tough layer on your actual skin that's different than the one in your mouth that's a little bit more soft, right? So, um, identification tips for this one: cells near the top layer are flat and they may be flaking off. So this is the keratin, that's the keratinized layer that's flaking off. Um, Cells near the basement membrane might not be flat, right? They might be a bit more cuboidal. Don't worry about that. Just look at these top layers to know what the type is. So a layer of stratified, multi-layer. Do you see all of these purple cells are part of the epithelium? This pink at the bottom is actually the connective tissue, okay? But all these layers over here, right? That's your stratified layers. Squamous, they're squishy, right? They're kind of squishy layered. Um, I don't think we will. No, we won't see the cuboidal cells, stratified cuboidal. So don't even worry about it. You know that if there's multiple layers, we're probably looking at this stratified squamous. So, stratified many layers, squamous, squishy cells of the skin. This is an example of skin, let's say, right? This protects the internal organs, right? This protects stuff. So our skin protects basically everything inside of us, right? It's the first barrier that microbes need to breach to get inside of us. Um, and you see the little nuclei here, right? One thing to note, though, that sometimes the superficial cells, right, are dead, and so they slough off, right? This is all of our protection, right? All protection. And the ones that are at the top, right, are these dead cells that are actually going off. Fun fact, all the dust in your house that you have, if you don't have a pet, all the dust that you have in your house is actually most of it is your skin cells that are just sloughing off and going and accumulating on the floor. It's dead skin, right? So this is really are these superficial cells, and they protect the deeper layers, right? So these superficial cells, you have the good layer here, but it kind of makes an additional barrier. Keratin is a protein which increases the toughness of these layers, and it prevents water loss. So water um, is not going to be able. It's waterproof, this keratin. So actually, we don't absorb water through our skin, right? But the opposite is true. We don't lose water that's inside of us through our skin unless it's through sweat glands, right? But water will never go through this layer and go out. It's always through sweat glands, which you don't even see here. So it's controlled very well. So keratin actually prevents us from losing water. The first thing that burn victims who have been burnt, any person that has had this third degree burn, the first thing that people are scared about, that the ambulance team is scared about, is an excessive water loss. And if they had a very severe burn, the first thing to do is to really hydrate them with an intravenous solution of saline, of water, so that they can be rehydrated, because the medical team is scared that they lose lost too much of this water from their skin. So actually, keratin is important in preventing water loss from our bodies. The deeper cells, as I said, I don't really care too much about them, but at the bottom here, you have this layer of regenerative cells. These newer cells, we're going to see in the skin lecture, they are at the bottom and they will divide and make up the newer cells that are on top. And all of these cells kind of migrate to the top until they die up here. And we'll talk about why that is. All right. So over here, you actually have in the esophagus and in your mouth, right, in the oral cavity, you have a non-keratinized epithelium. Do you see this basement membrane here, right? You have the basement membrane. You have connective tissue at the bottom with these blood vessels in it, right? So the blood vessels can feed over here the epithelium that's above it. At the top here, you end up having these squishy cells, right? Simple squamous ones. And so this is a simple squamous, sorry, I take that back. You have this stratified squamous epithelium that's found here. This one is the keratinized type, so it's skin, right? Most of our outer skin layer. This has the same thing. So you see this stratified squamous epithelium. And then the dead cells over here, all the keratinized, keratin dying cells here, you see them at the top, right? So this would be that flaky, if you scratch your skin lightly, actually you see little cells coming off of it. That's this keratin that's coming off the dead cells. And then at the bottom, of course, as I said, you have your basement membrane and you have connective tissue at the bottom here. So that's the difference between non-keratinized and keratinized. We'll talk a bit more about it when we get to the integumentary system. So I want you to pause the video here and I want you to try to fill out this table. Remember I told you structure and function go together. I want you to name for each of these structures, what is the function of this specific structure, right? What is the epithelial classification, right? And explain how the epithelium anatomy allows this organ to do its job, its function, okay? So I will ask you to pause the video and you can take a few minutes to do this. Okay, so over here, the oral cavity, the function of this structure is to actually bring in food into the mouth, right? So you could write ingest food, right? Ingest food. Also, right, one thing I'm going to mention here, and I'll tell you why I'm writing it here too, is the oral cavity is taking in food, but it's also exposed to the outside world. Any opening in your body, right, anywhere that's entering into your body, is a potential for bacteria, viruses, and bad things to come in, right? So we'll talk about that in a bit. The esophagus, this is like a recall of the first lecture. The esophagus, the main function of this is to carry food down from the pharynx down into the stomach. So food transport, right? From the pharynx to the stomach, right? That's pretty much its only job. The small intestine here, right, C, the main function here is for nutrient absorption. So to absorb all the good stuff that you just ate. Without it, we would not have nutrients and we would die. That was morbid. Nutrient absorption. D, over here you have, I guess, skin, right? Not the leg, but the skin, right, on the outside. So let's write the function of this structure is basically protection, right? There's other functions, of course, but the main one is to protect us from the outside world so that things don't come in. In the oral cavity, what kind of epithelium do we have? In the oral cavity, as I said, it's exposed to many viruses, bacteria. We touch our mouth all the time. So actually, we need a protective layer, and the protective layers are usually stratified, right? Stratified. That's the second word. That's the first word. The how many layers? One or two layers. One layer or multiple layers. So this is multiple because it's protective. And the only one that we really talked about that's important is the is going to be the stratified squamous one, right? The other two we don't really talk about. In the esophagus, right? One thing to note. In the oral cavity, if you touch inside the oral cavity, it's soft, so it's actually non-keratinized, right? Keratinized. Over here for the esophagus, right? It's the same situation. As we go down this tube, we're still needing to protect. It's still exposed to the outside world, right? Like think of the little bacteria could get all the way there. Once we get to the stomach, right? We burn everything. The acids there will burn everything. And now, it's fine. Everything's protected, right? If you recall in the small intestine though, right? What did we see in the small intestine? That was a simple layer, right? Now that we've been through, I like to think of the stomach as the decontamination shower that got rid of all the bad stuff, right? And now we can enter into the small intestine. And here in the small intestine, we have a simple columnar, right? Epithelium. It's one layer of column-like and with microvilli, right? That's important to note. It has little microvilli. I'm sorry for my writing. It's hard to write with a computer. In the skin, right, we have protection. So actually, this is going to be a stratified squamous, as we had said for the other ones. But remember that skin, right, has this extra protective layer to prevent water loss. This is keratin, so it's keratinized. Keratinized. Oh, I don't think I spelled that right. Whatever. This is fine. This is the easy part. The hard part is linking, or the part that I find the most important, I should say, is linking why this is the classification for this organ. So I'm not going to write it all, but I'll discuss each of them with you. For the oral cavity, for instance, right? Why is it that we have this non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, right? Well, I kind of gave it away already. Our mouths are an opening to the outside world. It's exposed to the outside world over here, right? Bacteria 100% are constantly coming in and viruses. So we need a thick layer, stratified layer of these cells. So that's why we have this stratified squamous. Esophagus, same thing. We have not gotten rid of all the bad pathogens yet. The stomach is the decontamination shower that burns everything. It's a bath of acid that burns the shit out of everything over here. So we need to get there first. So in the esophagus, we still need this non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium because we are still exposed to the outside world. When we get to the intestine, after the stomach, the intestine, now that everything's been decontaminated, now we can absorb things, right? That's where nutrient absorption happens. So there's a simple layer, one layer, right? Why is it one layer? Because you want it to easily absorb through. If I had multiple layers, I wouldn't be absorbing very much, right? So simple, and columnar with microvilli because the microvilli help us to have more surface area, right? So more surface so that I could absorb stuff. The skin, right, is a layer that is stratified squamous keratinized because This is exposed to the outside world all the time. Imagine this was a thin layer. Bad bacteria and viruses would constantly get in our blood. We'd be dying and falling over like flies, right? So our skin is essential for protection. This thick layer, stratified, means that we can protect ourselves from the outside world. And keratinized because we don't want to evaporate out water very easily. We want to retain it in our body. So we have this waterproofing layer of keratin. Let's do this little question. Classify the types of epithelium below based on their structure and state some possible functions of these cells. So I will give you a minute, pause the video. Alrighty, so over here, right, what do we see? We see pockets, right? Remember, pockets means that maybe we've cut something in a three-dimensional structure and we're just looking at the 2D, right? So we see these pockets and we see, do you see these thin cells, right? Looks kind of like one layer over here, right? So this is a simple layer around these pockets, simple, of squamous squishy cells, right? It's not cuboidal, it's not columnar. And remember, the function of simple squamous, right, is that they're thin. They are the thinnest possible layer, and they're squishy. They're small, 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 as thin as possible. The actual cell is as thin as possible, and it's only one layer of it. So this is very useful for diffusion, right? This is very useful for places where we need to let things through and diffuse through, like a lot of things need to diffuse through. This is not where we're protecting stuff. So 2 locations we talked about was in the depths of the lung, right? Once we gotten rid of all the bad stuff, right? And we get to the depths of the lung, air can exchange through the alveoli into the blood vessels, right? So both blood vessels and alveoli have thin little epithelium. Over here, right, you see a layer of epithelium. You see a basement membrane here. You see that nuclei are at different heights, right? Do you see how they're at different heights here? That's giving me a pseudostratified, a wannabe stratified. And when we talked about pseudostratified, I gave you 2 other hints to look for. If we look over here, right, do you see the little hairs on top, right? Those are cilia, right? That's little cilia, little brushes on the top of the cells. So you see that there are little cilia. That's definitely pseudostratified. And over here, do you see these big globby goblets, right? You see the goblet cells here? Those are full of mucus, right? So this is definitely a wannabe stratified epithelium, right? And therefore, where would we locate this? This would be in the trachea, we said, in the nasal cavity. All underneath is what? It is connective tissue. You actually see a blood vessel here, and you see little red blood cells inside of it, right? So this is our connective tissue. And what did I want to say? State some functions of this pseudostratified epithelium. Well, this pseudostratified epithelium would function, right, to protect the trachea, because the goblet cells would secrete mucus into this space, the free space, and it would trap the debris. And then the cilia would brush up the debris away from the lungs to make sure it doesn't go down into the lungs, right? So I would say this protective function, and you could explain what the cilia do, what the goblet cells do. So that's the pseudostratified epithelium. Over here, right, this is a big layer, right? This is many cells. Here's the connective tissue underneath and the basement membrane. So this is a stratified layer for sure. Stratified, right? The only stratified layer we talked about was the simple one, so I'll call it, the only stratified layer was the squamous one. the squishy cells. Again, as I told you, like over here, you see these nice squishy cells up here, but at the bottom, they look a bit more cube-like. So always focus on the top ones. But as I said, stratified, we just talked about squamous. And so the stratified squamous epithelium, last thing to add about this, we don't see the keratin on top, so it's non-keratinized, meaning it's not waterproofing us. So it's not our outer skin, it's every other opening to the body though, right? Our mouth, our esophagus, right? Any hole into our body, right? So the vaginal canal, the rectum would have this as well, because these are all openings into the body. These are all places that you would find this non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Before going to this, I want to go back to our little chart here. We just went through surface epithelium, right? We saw that simple squamous epithelium was there to help with diffusion since it's thin. Simple columnar had low microvilli, allowed us to absorb stuff. Pseudostratified secreted a bunch of mucus and protected us with the little cilia that brushed away stuff in the trachea. And stratified squamous was there to protect us. It was a thick layer that helped us in terms of protection. Now, so we're done with the surface epithelium. The last thing to look at is the glandular epithelium. So glandular epithelium has some cells around it, right? And actually it's certain types of these cells do. But the way we classify glands is actually more on whether they're endocrine or exocrine. So that's what we'll talk about now. So glandular epithelial tissue is an epithelial tissue that forms glands, okay? And these are cells or groups of cells that secrete a product, right? Glands secrete stuff. The other stuff we just saw now doesn't really secrete stuff. It's just a layer, it lines, it covers. Whereas this glandular stuff makes something and secretes it. Maybe a sweat gland secretes sweat, right? Maybe certain little glands in the liver make bile, hormones, right? These are all substances that could be secreted, products that could be secreted. But glands can be categorized into two main groups, okay? We could have exocrine glands and endocrine glands. Exocrine glands are secretions that exo means to exit, right? Exo, exit. They exit the body's surfaces or cavities through ducts. So they're actually exiting out, right? So, for example, you could have mucus that's being secreted out, sweat being secreted out onto the skin, oil secreted out onto the hair follicle, milk being secreted out of the breasts. So that's all certain examples. Now, one thing I want you to note, this is secretions exit the body surfaces or cavities through ducts, right? So basically it's going to the outside world, and this is the outside world, our skin, right? That's easy for us to think of. I want you to also think of the digestive system as the outside world, right? So all of the passageway from the mouth all the way to the anus, right? That is, I had a physiology teacher that once said the human body is like one big donut, right? We have one big hole that goes from mouth all the way to the other end. We're a donut. It's just that it's convoluted in different ways at different areas. So the digestive tract is still kind of like the outside world, right? That tube that goes from mouth to the other end is like the outside world. So if you secrete some mucus into the digestive tract, then mucus glands would still fit our definition of an exocrine gland, right? Endocrine glands are secretions that must enter inside of our body, inside blood vessels. So endocrine glands distribute things into our body, right? They're not exiting our body. They are these little glands here are putting stuff into the blood. Um, and they don't use ducts. They use actually the blood vessels to go around, and they go everywhere in the body. We'll see that in the endocrine system. So, um, for example, right, secreting hormones, right, these chemical messengers that'll go in the blood and affect other areas, right? The example I always give for the endocrine system is the sex hormones such as testosterone, right? Testosterone are a bunch of little glandular cells that in the testes that make testosterone, put it in the blood, and it affects a wide area of the human body, right? You have hair growing in certain places, you have your voice changing, you have a bunch of things, changes linked. So actually, these cells, endocrine cells, make certain substances that go in the blood and could have a widespread effect on the whole body. So that was all for epithelial tissue. Now we move on to connective tissue, probably the worst of all of them. Connective tissue is the garbage can that we can't seem to kind of lump properly, right? It connects things together. That's how we categorized it. We're going to see that I'm going to abbreviate CT sometimes, connective tissue, solid, proper, and fluid. So, connective tissue, it's actually the most abundant tissue. It's the most widely distributed in many different organs, and it's the most diverse type because some are hard as a rock, some are fluid like a liquid, right? So it's very diverse. I'll give you an example. Over here is the arm, right? And I want us to explore a few types of connective tissue that we find over here. We're going to see, first of all, adipose tissue, fat, right? There's a layer of fat under the skin. These little blibs here are fat tissue, adipose. That's a type of connective tissue. It connects things together. It actually is a padding, right, for protection a little bit more, but it fills up space, right? That's kind of the definition. It fills up space. It's like the super glue of the body. Cartilage over here, right? It's around the bone. You see some cartilage, and that helps so that it doesn't rub against the other bone. So this is kind of filling up some space over here, and it's connecting. It's part of this connection between the bones. Bone itself is a type of connective tissue. So bone, right? These bones over here, they are the skeleton of the body. They connect the body together. Again, this is a stretch, but I think it makes sense. Like I do understand why there's this category. This one's weird, okay? Blood is a connective tissue. Think of your vessels, right, as hoses, your blood vessels as hoses. If they didn't have blood in it, right, they'd collapse. So the blood inside of it actually fills up the space, right? So by our definition, right, it fills up spaces, it connects things, it actually interconnects different parts of the body. So this is a connective tissue. This one's a stretch, I know. These make a bit more sense. In our skin, under the epithelium, if you recall, let me go back over here. Remember the skin over here? You had all this stuff underneath, and I said that's a connective tissue, right? Over here, I always said that under the epithelium is a connective tissue, right? Well, that's what we're talking about over here. Loose connective tissue that's under the skin. That's going to be some connection. That makes sense. That's the pure definition of connection. And over here you have fibrous connective tissue in these little tendons. You have connecting the muscle to a bone is this tendon. So we have fibrous connective tissue here. So altogether, if we piece all of this together, I don't need you to know the anatomy of the arm. I just wanted to give you some examples and how we try to fit it into our definition. We're going to see each of these separately, the ones that we care about. So the general function of all connective tissues, it fills up spaces in the body. Very vague because we have so many different types of connective tissue. The rule I want you to know for connective tissue is that there are three main components in connective tissue. There are cells, okay, and cells support the function of the connective tissue. So it depends what kind of connective tissue you are. We're going to see this in a bit, but these are the cells over here that are the base of what this tissue is. Then what's interesting about connective tissue is that unlike the other types, like we saw epithelium, it was just the cells, right? But connective tissue is different. It's cells plus stuff that they make. Cells, they make what we call ECM. They make extracellular matrix. They make extra outside of the cell. Extracellular means outside of the cell. Matrix means like a soup stuff, right? So they make extracellular matrix, which is stuff outside the cell. Epithelial cells barely make stuff that's on the outside. They are just cells there sitting there. But these cells are busy at work. They actually make stuff outside. They make stuff and then secrete it outside, right? So these cells here, they're going to make extracellular matrix. What is extracellular matrix? It's made of two things. It's made out of ground substance. So these cells make a broth, I like to call it. I think of this as a soup, right? These are the little vegetables, and these little cells, they make the ECM, right? So the ground substance is the soup, the broth between the cells and fibers, and this ranges in viscosity. It could be super solid or very liquid, and they make up, the ECM is also made up of proteins. Remember, cells make proteins, so they could make different fibers that have different physical properties, different strengths, different fibers that have different flexibilities or ability to recoil, like elastin. So all this to say, these little cells, connective tissue, yes, they have their cells, but more importantly, what makes them a connective tissue is that these cells make a lot of extracellular matrix that's made up of a broth and little fibers in it. I like to, and all together, right, this makes a connective tissue, right? This is what connective tissue looks like. It's barely just cells, right? Like you see cells, all these fibers, the soupy stuff around it. So I like to think of this like a soup, right? You have your vegetables, your cells, you have your noodles, little whatever, pasta noodles that are inside, and you have the broth that's in this pink color. So it's a true soupy glue that's there. And this is for all connective tissues. They all have cells, ground substance, protein, fibers, but look at how many types we have, right? How do we change that? The types. Each of these types, right? There's a wide variety of these types of connective tissue in the body, because they each have variations in the composition and the amount of these three components. So some of them will be more cells, some of them will be more soup, which will make it, more broth, which will make it more liquidy. Some of them will put more fibers, which will make it more stronger, right? So they could vary these elements and change what type of connective tissue they are. So yes, that's the three components. When I ask you what are the three components of connective tissue, you should tell me there's cells, there's ground substance, and there's protein fibers. All connective tissue have those three elements. I absolutely hate birds, but that's a totally other topic. But it's the only analogy that I figured out to explain connective tissue. So here we go. Birds, right, are like the cells of connective tissue, right? They actually make up the nest, the extracellular matrix, right? So these little birds are like the cells. Here are the cells, and they make stuff and secrete it outside, right? They secrete all this other stuff. So the birds are this cell, this cell, this cell, right? And they make the ECM, the extracellular matrix, with twigs, which are like protein fibers, right? Do you see these little twigs that make up the nest? And mud, which makes up the ground substance, right? So over here, right, your little nest that is made up from the bird, right, is made up of ground substance and protein fibers. If the bird puts more twigs, right, this nest is going to be prickly and not comfy, right? And it'll look like a different nest. If the bird instead puts a lot of ground substance and mud, it's going to be super goopy and very wet and not comfortable. That's going to be a totally other connective tissue, right? So that's why my analogy works, because you could change the nest and the connective tissue based on what you put there, okay? So here we go again with my bird analogy. You have the little bird here, which are the cells. And the cells, right, the type of cell actually depends on the location. Osteocytes. First of all, the term cytes is a root of the word that means cell. I don't know if it's Greek or some other root, but cytes means cells. So osteocytes are bone cells. Osteo, like osteopath or osteon, all of these refer to bones. Os in French means bone. So osteocytes and osteoblasts are bone cells. Chondrocytes and chondroblasts are these are cartilage cells. So we'll talk about chondro in a minute. Fibrocytes and fibroblasts, these are cells that make a lot of fibers. Like these fibers I talked about, the twigs, right? The protein fibers, these protein fibers, right? Adipocytes, I think I mentioned it. Adipose means fat, right? So adipocytes make fat, are fat cells, sorry. Blood cells, I think you know what those are. These are all different types of cells depending on the different type of connective tissue, right? Look at all these types of connective tissue. Each of these will have like a certain amount of those cells, right? More depending on what the type of tissue is. So as I said before, when you see the word blasts, right, these are immature cells that actively maintain and secrete ECM. So when you see the osteoblasts or the fibroblasts, right, chondroblasts, these are cells that are making a lot of extracellular matrix. The fibroblasts, for instance, are making a lot of the fibers, right? When they're fibrocytes, right, these are more of the mature cells, and that just maintains the ECM. So it'll still make it and maintain it, but it's not like growing the cartilage. So blasts are for building. This is when like you're making a lot of this and you're actually growing or something's happening. Cyte just means that it's a mature cell. And so fibroclast, this should say fibrocyte or fibroblast. That's the difference between them. So that's my cells. The main point of this was the connective tissue, depending on which type it is, has different types of cells, right? It depends what it is. We'll see for each of them what that would be. Ground substance, right? This muddy stuff, the broth, right, is mostly water and sticky proteins that bind water and influence fluidity, okay? So this is actually water and sticky proteins. So it's proteins that attract water. It's you don't need to know this. There's different proteoglycans that attract water. And so this ground substance, right? Think of it. If you have something like bone is a type of connective tissue that's very solid, right? That has a different ground substance compared to not much water, compared to something like blood, which would have a lot of ground substance, right? So, depending on what you are, cartilage is a little bit more watery, but not much. Uh, the connective tissue proper we'll see is in the middle a bit, and blood is very liquidy. So, depending on what type of tissue you are, you could have more or less ground substance. And lastly, protein fibers. You have different types of fibers. You have collagen fibers are the most common type of fiber, and they're strong and flexible. They're like rope that are. It's actually a triple helix here of collagen. Collagen is a triple helix. Maybe you heard collagen being good for your hair. It thickens your hair because this collagen protein is a triple helix and it forms a strong, just like rope that's kind of intermingled. It forms this tight connection. So that's collagen. That could make very strong connective tissue if there's a lot of collagen, like strong hair. Reticular fibers are thinner and they're less common. So they interweave to create an organ's shape. So here you see smaller little fibers and they kind of form this net, right? They shape the organ a bit. These are reticular fibers, and elasticy fibers are more like bungee cords. So they actually have this elasticity. They have this ability to recoil back. So that could be a type of connective tissue that bounces a little bit. We'll see where that might be useful. So this is what we have for our three main components of connective tissue. All right, so over here, connective tissue. Um, General things about connective tissue. It's the most abundant tissue type in the body, like we had said. It's made up of a variety of cells depending on which subtype they are. We just saw that over here. You could have a lot of ground substance, not much. You could have a lot of collagen. You could have not a lot of collagen, a lot of elastic fibers or not, right? So it's made up of a variety of cells depending on what cell types or subtypes. Sorry, this was cells, so it could be osteoblasts, osteocytes if it's bone, chondroblasts, chondrocytes if it's cartilage, on and on and on. Here, this is what I was talking about, contains much more extracellular matrix compared to other tissues. This is what defines a connective tissue, is that it has a lot of ECM. Epithelium, muscle, nervous doesn't have much ECM. Um, and subtypes of tissue, right? Bone, cartilage, areolar, adipose, blood, it changes, right? They vary, and they are what they are because they vary in fluidity depending on what cells they have, what ground substance, and what protein fibers. So, based on their mix of this and their proportions of that, they can change their subtype, right? Here are my subtypes of connective tissue I want you to know, and we'll take a look at them in a minute. So, some connective tissues offer physical support. These are called supporting connective tissues, right? They're strong. They're the least fluid of tissues. Bone is tough. It's not very fluid. Cartilage is a little less tough, but still very firm, right? Such as the cartilage in your ear, right? This is less. It's not fluid at much at all, and it's very tough, right? Then at the other end of the spectrum, the most fluid connective tissue is this blood, right? This is watery substance. It's the most fluid, and this blood, right? This fluid connective tissue is used to transport stuff through the body, right? And then in the middle, between being very tough like bone or very liquid like blood, is the middle ground. This is called connective tissue proper. Um, this binds, supports, and protects organs and tissues. So we're going to talk about loose areolar connective tissue and adipose tissue. Okay, that's like not too fluid, but not too tough. All right, so let's talk about bone. some characteristics of bone. This is a supporting connective tissue, right? It's tough. It's rock-like hard, right? It's vascularized, meaning it has vessels, vascular vessels, blood vessels going to it. You know this because if you break a bone, you could actually heal it. There are blood vessels that can go and feed the other cells and it can heal. It's also innervated, meaning there are nerves, neurons that go to it. So many nerves. You know this because it's painful if you break a bone, right? There are nerves in it and it hurts. The cells that make it are osteocytes and osteoblasts. Remember, osteoblasts are the builders, right? They secrete and they make bone ECM. Osteocytes, they're the retired bone cells. They're mature. They maintain the bone. They do make some ECM, but they kind of just maintain it. They don't grow it actively. The extracellular matrix, in terms of protein fibers, we have a lot of collagen fibers. Remember, we said collagen fibers were strong. So that's where bones get their strength. And the ground substance that we have is very minimal, but it's mineralized, right? So it's actually crystallized, right? And hardened layers of calcium phosphate salts. So this is a salt that is hardened and layered, right? So it makes this thick layer. And the function of bone, right, is to provide levers for muscles to act on. It's the skeleton, right? Bones are it's just a skeleton that gives us a skeleton, right? It gives us a shape, right? Without bones, we'd be all collapsed. And muscles actually, for example, there's a muscle that connects from one bone to another, and as the muscle pulls on the other bone, it lifts the other bone. So the bones act as levers, right? They also provide structural support. An example of a bone that provides structural support is something like the sternum, right? It protects the heart, right? So some bones protect, the ribs protect the lungs, the skull protects the brain, the sternum protects the heart over here. And if you look at bone under a microscope, this is what you would see. You would see these concentric rings with this canal in the middle. This is called the central canal, and it contains a lot of blood vessels and nerves in the bone, right? So this is like if you cut a bone in two, you would see this. It's crazy. It looks like mini tree trunks with concentric circles in it. This is how the bone organizes. It's very neat. And in these concentric circles, right, you find these little black dots. These are the osteocytes, but all the pink stuff that it makes around it, right, that's actually the extracellular matrix that these osteocytes have made. And they make them in these ring kind of formations and form the bone that way. So that's bone. That's the hardest type of connective tissue, the least fluid. Then a little bit less fluid, a little bit more fluid than bone, but still very tough is cartilage, right? Cartilage is less hard, but more flexible than bone, right? Think of like the cartilage in your ears, you can move it, right? But it's still hard, but it's a little bit more flexible. It is avascular. Bone was vascular, right? So there's no blood vessels. This causes very slow healing. If you don't have blood going somewhere, you can't heal that tissue. So that's why, if you pierce your cartilage, right, like in your ears, it takes long to go and heal. And it's also not innervated, right? So not many nerves that are there. So it's not painful as much. So when you pierce your ears, as opposed to if you stab your skin, right? The cartilage actually, it's not too bad. It does hurt, like don't get me wrong, but it's not as painful, let me tell you, as if it were some other type of tissue, right? So it's not innervated. It doesn't have many nerves going to it. And this again, the same thing. What cells are there, right? Remember, we ask our three questions. We ask what cells, what ground substance, what protein fibers, right? So over here, we ask ourselves, what cells are there? They are called chondrocytes, right? And chondroblasts. Chondro means cartilage, okay? So the chondrocytes maintain the cartilage ECM, right? That and they sit inside little cavities called lacunae. Here are the chondrocytes in the cartilage, and they sit in little holes called lacunae. So they're sitting in these little pits, and they're making all of this purplish ECM on the outside. Okay, chondroblasts are constantly making the ECM. These are the more immature cells. They're growing the cartilage, and then they become retired chondrocytes that just maintain the ECM. They don't make too much of it. Um, Extracellular matrix, right? So what is this ECM, this light purple stuff? Um, we have protein fibers. So, for example, collagen, right? But it differs based on the subtype of cartilage that we have. So it's still tough, right? Like cartilage is very tough, but it's not as hard as bone. So there is collagen there to make it very tough. Um, and the ground substance has a lot of proteoglycans that differ based on the subtype. So they have, it really depends on the type of cartilage. The function of cartilage is to support things, cushion things, and resist compression. It's not like bone. Bone doesn't resist compression very well. It snaps because it's like a mineralized ground substance, so it easily snaps. So this is actually something that resists compression. Like your ear could bend and flip. Your nose here, right? It can move a little bit, the cartilage. In between your vertebral discs, in between your vertebrae are what we call intervertebral discs. And these are cartilage pads, and they allow a bounce, a little bit of a cushion. That's why when you jump, right, you're not going to squish your nerves that are coming out on the sides. There's a little cushion to bounce on. It resists compression. And over here, at the ends of a lot of your long bones, you have some cartilage. Again, as your bones move, you don't want them scraping on each other because they're mineralized. They would scrape and scrape off, and actually they'd affect all the nerves in your bones. So you actually this padding of cartilage allows there to be a bit of resistance, and if they touch each other, it doesn't hurt as much. It doesn't matter as much. So that's what cartilage is important for. Then we have fluid connective tissue, like blood. And so fluid connective tissue, this is the most liquid of tissues, connective tissues inside the body. And this is found in blood vessels, which connects all tissues together, right? It's a bit of a stretch. The cells that you find in here are red blood cells called erythrocytes. These are very important to carry oxygen and carbon dioxide, our respiratory gases. So red blood cells, they carry our gases, our respiratory gases like oxygen. There's also leukocytes. Leuko sounds like leukemia, which is a type of white blood cell cancer. So leukocytes are white blood cells, and they provide immunity in our body. They actually protect us from pathogens, bad stuff, bacteria, viruses, right? So leukocytes are also found in our blood. Look at this, all of this stuff, right? You have a bunch of these red blood cells. Do you see that they're like little spheres with little wider parts in the middle? Those are your erythrocytes, your red blood cells. And then every now and then you see these bigger cells with a weird nuclei, right? Those are your leukocytes. There's not that many compared to the red blood cells, but they are there. And obviously, so that's your blood. Um, those are the cells of the blood, but then you have ECM, right? Extracellular matrix, the soup of the cells, and so you have some protein fibers, which are soluble proteins, right, that easily dissolve in the liquid. And the ground substance is a watery fluid, extremely watery. You know that blood is watery, so there's a lot of ground substance. And actually, we call it a special name. We call it plasma. Plasma is the watery substance of blood. So all of this stuff you see in between the cells is called plasma. And so the function of blood is to transport oxygen and CO2 and nutrients and wastes through the human body, right? That's kind of the big general idea of blood. Uh, so that's what we have for our blood. Now, I went from very tough connective tissue to very fluid connective tissue, and now I want to go in the middle ground. This is called connective tissue proper. Um, we're going to see this loose areolar tissue. Basically, before I go there, cells in connective tissue proper, especially this loose areolar connective tissue, have many types of cells. They have fibroblasts here that secrete ECM and make a lot of this ECM. You have fibrocytes that just maintain the ECM, they're the retired fibroblasts. Adipocytes over here are full of fat, triglycerides, they pack with triglycerides. Um, then you have mast cells. These release histamine. Macrophages are large phagocytic cells. Phago means to eat, cytic cells. So they eat other cells. So they are maybe bacteria or bad stuff that comes in, or damaged cells in your body they can eat. So they're perusing the connective tissue to see if there's anything bad coming in. So all of this is some cells. You see this connective tissue proper has, unlike the bone and blood that have their typical cells, these connective tissue proper have many cell types. So loose areolar connective tissue is the most widely distributed connective tissue in the body. It's vascularized. It has blood vessels in it, um, which is very important. It has fibroblasts, fibrocytes, mast cells, macrophages, adipocytes, many types of cells, as we just saw. Uh, Extracellular matrix. It's a gel-like matrix and has different fiber types in the ECM. So I don't need you to know which ones, just that it's not hard as bone. It is not liquid as blood. It's in between. It's like gelatinous a bit. Okay. Um, and the location and function of this, right? It's found under all epithelium. Areolar connective tissue. Remember, I said there's epithelial cells, and under it you find this areolar tissue. That is where you find it, and it provides nutrients and removes wastes via blood vessels. So here in the areolar tissue, you have blood vessels that will send stuff around, right? Nutrients and wastes, and it feeds the upper epithelium. This is essential. You need areolar connective tissue, or else these epithelial would die and they would not function, right? They would necrose and actually go black and they would die, right? You actually see some patients sometimes that have necrotizing tissue that is not well fed by the blood vessels. It wraps and protects and cushions organs too. It kind of has this layering effect. Very important. Under all epithelia, you find this. So it's the true connective tissue that connects things, connects the epithelium down to the body. So you see little fibroblasts here, right? You see them and their fibers that they're making. So the darker spots are the nuclei. You see light fibers, probably reticular ones. You see thicker fibers, probably stuff like collagen, right? So there's many types of fibers here. It looks, to me, this is the true super glue of the body. It holds everything together in place, right? And lastly, we have adipose tissue. So this stores energy and it insulates the body. So over here you have these big cells, right? These are these big yellow cells. Um, and these cells are called adipocytes. Adipose tissue is fat, so adipocytes are fat cells. Cyte means fat cell. Adipo means fat, so adipocytes. They're filled with triglycerides. Remember the triglycerides? Let me draw them over here. These little triglycerides, right, have three fatty acid tails and a glycerol. Three fatty acid and glycerol. So these cells are packed tight, full with these triglycerides. And these triglycerides, are hydrophobic. They're so hydrophobic that they push their nuclei to the edges. Do you see how the little dots that are usually in the middle of cells, they're pushed to the sides of the cells? So this is a real picture. You see these little adipocytes, right? And actually you see over here, each cell pushes their nuclei to the edge because the nuclei is actually water soluble. It likes water, but the fat doesn't like water. So the fat is so hydrophobic that it pushes the nuclei to the edges. So that's our cells that we have. ECM, the extracellular matrix, there's not much ECM matrix, but it is highly vascularized, right? So there are a lot of blood vessels there. The function you should know of adipose tissue is to provide long-term energy reserves. So you know this, a little squirrel, right, in the winter gets a bit chunky because they're going to hibernate and they're going to have that fat to burn off and fuel them while they're hibernating in the winter. So fat provides us long-term energy reserves when we don't eat and we fast for a while. Um, Adipose tissue also insulates against heat loss and cold. Same situation with the squirrel, especially in the winter here. They get nice and chunky because it's cold outside, and so they get a lot of fat, which insulates the heat in their body to stay inside during the cold winters. Um, Same thing for humans, right? Fat helps to keep heat inside. It also cushions and protects organs. Without fat, we wouldn't be able to protect our visceral organs. It's actually a cushion to protect them. Here you see fat tissue protecting, let's say over here, the eyes, right? So you're actually, it is a form of protection, not too much of it, but just the right amount. And the location, right? It's in the deepest layers of the skin, right? So actually here is skin. You have your epithelium, you have your connective tissue, and under that is a lot of adipose tissue in our skin layer. The bottom um, the hypodermis has a lot of this adipose tissue. Within the abdomen and breasts, we have an accumulation. So over here in the abdominal regions, we have a lot because we want to protect our visceral organs, our most important organs that are there. And around our eyes and kidneys, we do have a lot of fat as well. Moving on to our third type of tissue is muscle tissue. So muscle tissue, the main function of all the types of muscle are that they contract and they allow movement, right? So here for our muscle tissue, the main verb here is it contracts. You have skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. Skeletal muscle is to move. Smooth muscle constricts and dilates stuff. Cardiac muscle pumps stuff. So let's take a look over here. Our muscle tissue is specialized for contraction and it allows movement, right? So some common features of all muscle. All muscles are highly vascularized, meaning here are muscle cells underneath and you see blood vessels surrounding them. Lots of blood vessels. We actually need to feed our muscle cells with a lot of nutrients, glucose, a lot of oxygen. We need to eliminate their wastes. So it's very important that muscles are highly vascularized. The second feature that you'll notice in all muscle tissues, is that they're tightly packed cells. So muscle cell sheets create more contractile force. Here you have this skeletal muscle that is tightly packed, cardiac muscle too, and smooth muscle So um, they form sheets because they work together in unison to contract. Then you have all muscle tissue contain what we call myofilaments. Anything myo that has myo in front of it, you should think muscle. So myofilaments, muscle filaments. Inside muscle, you have thin filaments and thick filaments, which allow for muscle contraction. So here in blue, you have these thin filaments and these bigger, thicker rowers, the thick filaments. And basically, these myofilaments allow for contraction. You see that during a muscle contraction, the muscle fibers get in, and then relaxation, they move out. They get in and they get out. So in a muscle, right? You know this when you contract a muscle, right? You're actually the muscle could sometimes bulge out, right? But that's because all the myofilaments are coming inwards and pushing the muscle inwards. So there's contraction. So all types of tissue are able to contract that are muscle tissue. That's the common features between all muscle tissue. That's why there's a bin for muscle tissue. There's three types of muscle tissue. Um, there are cardiac muscle in the heart, smooth muscle in a lot of tracts, especially the digestive organs, and there is skeletal muscle, muscles that are connecting bones together. All right, so for skeletal muscles, we're gonna start with that. Then we'll do cardiac smooth. So for skeletal muscles, these cells are long cylindrical cells. Do you see? This is one entire skeletal muscle cell. This is another one, and this is another one. They're actually quite big. They're long cylinders. Um, we also sometimes call them muscle fibers. That's the same as a muscle cell. Sometimes we use that term. They are multinucleated, meaning there's multiple nuclei. Most cells we saw so far have only one nuclei in the middle, right? But these have, here I see 1, 2, 3 nuclei to this cell, 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 on this cell. So there's multiple nuclei per one cell. Why is this the case? Because they need to meet high protein demand. These skeletal muscles, like your biceps, right? They are constantly needing to get energy, right? We're constantly moving our muscles. We don't even realize it, but even small moves, our muscles are contracting. So we need to constantly make these little muscle proteins, right? The thin and the thick filaments. These are proteins we need to keep building, even if we're not bodybuilders. We still move our muscles all the time. These skeletal muscle cells have visible striations. Do you see that there's like this zebra striping, dark band, light band, dark band, light band? This is a very typical thing for a skeletal muscle because the myofilaments, right, the actin and the myosin, the thin filaments and the thick filaments we talked about over here, they are patterned in a very unique way. You see the darker bands where these thick filaments are and lighter bands where it's just thin filaments. So you actually see this patterning due to the actin and myosin that line up in such a way. The control of this muscle is mostly under voluntary control. Think of all skeletal muscles are muscles that are on your skeleton and move your bones, your skeleton, your bones, right? So all of these you can use your brain and ask it to move. Right now I can ask you to reach for a cup. I could ask you to contract your bicep. I could ask you to stand up. All of those muscles are under voluntary control. You're able to do it. Sometimes it's involuntary. It's a little exception when it's a reflex, right? So when the doctor hits your knee with that little hammer, your leg will kick up. That's involuntary. But that's a little exception to our rule. And lastly, what is the function of skeletal muscle? It forms the actual muscle organs. The muscles we think about, this is the type of muscle you always think about when you talk about them. These attach bones from bone to bone, and they act as levers. I want you to look at this picture very carefully. This muscle, the biceps here, is connecting your bone up at the top here, and it's inserting itself over here on this bone. When it contracts, it pulls this bone closer inside. So they truly are pulling kind of like a puppet on your skeleton. Your skeleton doesn't move, right? It's just limp, and then muscles will pull them and lift them and push them around. So that's very important for skeletal muscle. When you look at skeletal muscle, right? Again, let's talk about what we see. We see striations, right? Like the zebra. We see big muscle fibers, very big, and they are multinucleated. They have a lot of nuclei. They're parallel, right? They're all in line together. So here are 1, 2, 3.5 muscle fibers, right? So you see this is one skeletal muscle fiber, one skeletal muscle cell with many striations, dark bands, light bands, and multiple nuclei. So this is your typical skeletal muscle. For cardiac muscle, however, these are a bit different in that they are branched cells. Do you see over here you have this one cell and then whoop, it branches into two parts. So this is, we don't call them necessarily muscle fibers. We call them cardiomyocytes. Myo means muscle. Remember I told you? Myocyte, muscle cell. So cardiomyocytes are also what we call these. They have striations, right? Do you see these? Again, if you look very closely, it's a bit harder to see in this picture, but there are striations, I promise you. I'll show you a better picture in a second. So they're striped, again, due to the actin and the myosin that are lined up in a specific way, like the skeletal muscle. These, however, are uninucleate. They have one nuclei. So do you see this one cell has one nucleus? This one cell here has just one nuclei, so they just have one nucleus. And they have a specific structure that is called an intercalated disc. To intercalate, right, means to come together, right? Kind of like your fingers intercalated. They look like that, actually. So inter means between, right? So intercalated discs are these little striations. Do you see these little darker areas, right? They're structures that join the ends of cardiomyocytes. That's how you know that you're moving on to another cell. This intercalated disc here is showing you one cardiac cell on this side and a separate one on the other side. So these little zigzags here, these little breaks that are darker stained, those are intercalated discs, and they join cardiomyocytes together, and they're anchoring the cells together. Why is that important? Because cardiomyocytes need to talk to each other so that they pump together in the same beat, right? These cardiac muscle cells, I think you can imagine, they're found in the heart. They need to beat together, right? So these are the intercalated discs. Control, they're under involuntary control. So we are not in control of this muscle. I'll test that right now. I'll ask you to go and voluntarily contract your right chamber of your heart. I don't think you can do that. If you do, call me. We'll send you to a lab. So this is under involuntary control. You are not in control of it. Your nervous system is doing this, helping to control it though. So this is happening on its own. It's involuntary. Pacemaker cells, this is interesting. Pacemaker cells are actually in the heart itself, and they establish the heart rate. So this little electrical wave that you've maybe seen on TV, right? This happens because there are cells in the heart that they create the pace of the heart. And as I said before, the nervous system just fine tunes how fast the heart is beating. But if you take a heart out of a body, it'll actually, and you put the right ions around it, it'll beat on its own. There is a pacemaking cell that is allowing the heart to beat. And lastly, what is the function of cardiac muscle? It circulates blood in the body and it maintains blood pressure. The whole point of cardiac muscle, all of this stuff is cardiac muscle, right? Lining the sides of the heart. The whole point of that is that it pumps the heart, right? And it pushes the liquid. You see this liquid being ejected out, right? It's pushing the liquid and moving it through the body. So again, let me just go through the histology here. You see striations that are here. They're not the best. You see branching. These cells are branching into two. You see one nucleus per cell. And you see the intercalated disc zigzags between cells. That's how you know it's cardiac muscle tissue. As I said before, cardiac muscles are anchored to each other and communicate via these intercalated discs to be synchronized together. Here is one cardiac cell. Here is another cardiac cell, right? And over here, the connection that you have, these are called intercalated discs, right? And if I zoom in onto these intercalated discs, what do I see? This is cell number 1. This is cell number 2. And you see that anchoring them together are desmosomes. Remember, desmosomes in epithelium, they anchor two cells together, so they're close, they're tight. And you see these little ion channels that allow for communicating between the two cells. So the ions, like sodium or potassium, they can go into the next cell, and these are called gap junctions. So gap junctions are channels that allow the ions to pass through so that the nervous impulse can travel between the cells. These ions can pass to the next one and cause this muscle cell to contract, right? So it allows for the electrical activity to pass through so that the muscle can contract and do its job. So it allows them to be synchronized together and to contract simultaneously as one team. Imagine if this wasn't synchronized, right? Then the heart wouldn't be, look at how the heart beats, right? It's very methodical in the pace. If they were not coordinated with gap junctions and intercalated discs, they would be beating off beat. And actually that's what happens during arrhythmias or certain heart conditions, strokes, when the signals aren't being passed. During heart attacks, when the signals aren't being properly passed to where they need to go. So let's just look at another picture over here. So you see the striations, right? You see that the zebra is still there, and you see the intercalated darker discs here. You see that per cell there's about one nuclei. This is one cardiac muscle cell that branches out, right? So that's our cardiac muscle cell. And lastly, we have our smooth muscle cell. These cells are short spindle shaped. It looks weird in this under the microscope, but this is actually one cell over here. It looks like a spindle, right? It kind of looks like a squamous cell, but they're all packed tight like this, right? So cells are thin on the ends and thicker in the middle. They're uninucleate. They have one nuclei per cell, and actually it's in the center of the cell. It's located right smack in the middle. Some of these you don't see them because they're not cut in the right plane. And it appears smooth, right? Their appearance, due to the lack of striations, there's no striations, right? So we call them smooth muscle because we don't see striations. Here we saw striations. Here we don't, right? That's not because, remember I told you all muscle has actin and myosin. They all have thin and thick filaments, but the actin and myosin are not parallel. So you don't actually see the stripes. They're kind of interweaved in a weird kind of configuration, so you don't see the actin and myosin. And control, smooth muscle is under involuntary control. These muscles line the passageways that need to move substances. So, for example, they're around blood vessels. There's the epithelium in a blood vessel, and then you would have the smooth muscle around. So right now, I don't think I can ask you to constrict a blood vessel, right? It does happen. You don't know about it, but it's happening right now. and you don't know about it, it's involuntary, not voluntary control. Your GI tract, your entire tract of the gastrointestinal tract, the stomach, the intestines, all of these have smooth muscle wrapping around it. It has an epithelium, but it also has smooth muscle around, and it will constrict and squeeze the food through, right? So in your esophagus, it squeezes it down. In your intestines, in your stomach, right? So I don't think right now I can ask you to contract your esophagus or your stomach or your intestine, right? That's under involuntary control. We don't control that. And the functions of smooth muscle, right? As I told you, it's to control the diameter and propel material around, especially food in the GI tract, right? But it could also be, we saw them around blood vessels too. So here's your smooth muscle that contracts, bigger, smaller, pushing things around. This is what it looks like under the microscope. You see these spindle-like sheets, right? So they're smooth muscle. They have a central nuclei. You don't see striations here. So I will get you to fill this out. Pause the video 2 seconds, and then we can fill out this chart. All right, so skeletal muscle location. It connects bones to bones. So they're on from one bone to the other. So bones to bones, right? They're on our skeleton. It's voluntary, right? Voluntary. Is it striated? Yes, it is. Take a look over here. And the number of nuclei per cell, many, right? Cardiac muscle is found in the heart only, the walls of the heart, actually. It's under voluntary or involuntary. Can you contract your heart right now? No. So it's under involuntary control. It is striated, and it has 1 nuclei per cell. The smooth muscle here is found our GI tract, right? It's also found in blood vessels, around blood vessels, around our GI tract. And again, when you have tubes like this, it's very useful to constrict them, right? But this is under involuntary. We're not in control. And we don't see any striations. That's why they call it smooth. And there's 1 nuclei per cell. Now, nervous tissue is the very last one. And I'm going to brief over it because we're going to see the nervous system soon. But the nervous tissue, it allows communication throughout the body. It allows us to send signals, electrical signals, to different regions. So nervous tissue communicates. We have neurons that conduct electricity and neuroglia that support the neurons. Okay, so where is nervous tissue located? You're going to right away think of the brain. You're going to right away think of the spinal cord. This is actually mostly nervous tissue. There's other tissues in it though, but mostly nervous tissue. The one that you might not think of is everywhere else in your body, like in your periphery, all of these things. You have nerves that come out to your tissues. Like you feel sensation in your skin, you must have nerve endings over here that send info up to the brain. So all these nerves also account for nervous tissue. And nervous tissue is made up of 2 types of cells. We have neurons. These are the cells that conduct electrical signals from one part of the body to another. So this is one neuron talking to another neuron that's been cut off here. And so it'll receive a signal over here. Maybe that's on the ends of your finger. And it receives the signal and then it transmits that through a long process over here. You see this long wire that goes to the next neuron to tell it what it saw, right? So it conducts electricity, right? When you stick your finger in an electrical socket and you get a shock, that right, is the same thing that's passing through this neuron, okay? Neuroglial cells, right, are not neurons. They support neurons by surrounding them, protecting them, and insulating the neurons. Okay, so these do, all I need you to know for now, they do not conduct electricity. They help support the cells, the neurons. So neurons are the big fame. They send electricity, which is important to send signals. But the other cells, Schwann cells, oligodendrocytes, microglia, ependymal, astrocytes, these are all called neuroglia, and they help support the neurons in different ways so they could do its job. The big job is the neuron that sends electricity. It sends the signals, but the other cells help support it. So here in this picture, again, there's a size difference. You see this big star-like cell. This is a neuron with a big cell body, and it has these weird processes coming out, and this one long wire coming out here, that's a neuron. All the rest, do you see these little nuclei around it? Those are neuroglial cells that are helping the neuron. We'll talk about them later. They're doing other jobs to help the neuron work properly. But the neuron is what picks up signals here, and then it sends it down this wire. Just like the electrical wires on our streets, they send it down a cable to the next neuron, and then to the next, and to the next. And that's all for this topic on tissues.